Welcome to the Daily English Podcast. Make your learning exciting and engaging with interesting stories.
The call came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, and it changed everything within the span of 11 minutes. My husband's father had passed away, leaving him the family construction business, 3 commercial properties, and just under $4 million. Before the funeral flowers had even wilted, he handed me divorce papers in our kitchen and told me I'd been convenient for 11 years. I signed without arguing and walked out of that house with 2 suitcases. He threw a party that weekend, certain I'd come crawling back once the shock wore off. 3 years later, he hired a private investigator to track me down. My name is Sarah Whitfield, and none of this makes sense unless you understand how it started, not with the money, but with a phone call on a gray Thursday in Denver. I was making dinner when David's phone rang. I remember it exactly because I just put the chicken in the oven and was wiping my hands on a dish towel when I saw his face change. His father, Robert Whitfield, had suffered a massive heart attack at his office in Lakewood. By the time David got there, it was already over. The next few weeks blurred together the way grief does. I handled the calls, the caterers, the flowers, the endless casseroles from neighbors who meant well. David barely spoke. He sat in his father's old recliner most evenings, staring at nothing, and I told myself this was normal, that men grieved differently, that he'd come back to himself eventually. I brought him coffee. I canceled my own plans. I answered condolence cards addressed to both of us in my handwriting, because his hands, he said, wouldn't stop shaking. I loved him for 11 years without once questioning whether that love was noticed. That should have told me something. The reading of the will happened on a Tuesday morning at a law office downtown. David's mother had passed years earlier, so it was just him, his older sister Kimberly, and me sitting in the waiting room with bad coffee in paper cups. When the attorney read out the numbers, I actually reached over and squeezed David's hand, genuinely happy for him, genuinely relieved that some good, however small, might come out of all that grief. Whitfield Construction, 3 commercial properties in Colorado, just under $4 million in combined assets and life insurance. David nodded along like he already knew, and I remember thinking, of course he knew, he's exhausted. He's not really absorbing any of this yet. I was wrong about that too. The change didn't happen all at once. If it had, I might have caught it sooner. It started with small things. The way he stopped asking me how my day went, the way he'd glance at his phone screen and turn it face down when I walked into the room. He started going to the office earlier and coming home later, which made sense, I told myself, since he was learning to run his father's company. He started correcting me in front of people. Small things. The way I mispronounced a client's name at a dinner. The way I'd ordered the wrong wine at a business function his new accountant had invited us to. You don't have to come to these things anymore, he told me one night, not looking up from his laptop. I know they're not really your world. I asked him what he meant by that, and he just shrugged, the same shrug I'd seen him give contractors who asked questions he didn't feel like answering. That shrug used to be reserved for people he considered beneath his attention. I didn't let myself think about what it meant that he was using it on me now. 3 weeks after the will was finalized, he bought a new truck. Not practical, not the kind we would have discussed together the way we discussed every major purchase in 11 years of marriage. A brand new black pickup with an interior that smelled like money, parked in our driveway like a private declaration. When I asked about it, he said, "I don't have to ask anyone anymore. And something in the way he said anyone made my stomach drop because I understood, even then, that he didn't mean the bank. That was the night I started paying closer attention. Not because I suspected divorce. That thought genuinely hadn't crossed my mind yet, but because I sensed the way you sense weather changing before the sky actually darkens, that the man sitting across from me at dinner wasn't entirely the same man I had married. He ate faster. He looked at his phone more. He laughed at things I said less, and when he did laugh, it wasn't really at what I'd said. It was more like he was laughing at me quietly from somewhere just out of reach. I told my sister Rachel about it over coffee, and she said the thing everyone says when they don't want to alarm you. Give him time. Grief does strange things to people. He just lost his father. I wanted to believe that so badly that I did, for a while. I made him his favorite meals. I gave him space. I told myself that whatever this was, we would get through it, because that's what 11 years of marriage was supposed to mean. I had no idea that the man test driving trucks and correcting my wine choices had already, in his mind, moved on without me. I had no idea that in 6 weeks, he would hand me an envelope in our own kitchen and use the word convenient to describe over a decade of my life. The next warning came on a Sunday afternoon in November, and it arrived in the form of a text message that lit up his phone while he was in the shower. I want to be honest about this part because it matters. I wasn't the kind of woman who read her husband's phone. 11 years, and I never once went looking through his messages, not because I was naive, but because I genuinely believed I didn't need to. That Sunday, though, his phone buzzed 3 times in a row on the kitchen counter, and the screen lit up bright enough that I saw it from across the room without meaning to. A name I didn't recognize. Jessica. The message previews were nothing dramatic, nothing you could hang an accusation on. Did you talk to the accountant yet? And don't forget dinner Thursday. But something about the familiarity of the tone made the back of my neck go cold. When David came downstairs, I asked him, as casually as I could manage, who Jessica was. New office manager, he said, not even glancing up from the coffee he was pouring. Handles scheduling for the properties now. It was a reasonable answer. It should have satisfied me. But I noticed, the way you notice a single wrong note in a song you've heard 100 times, that he answered too quickly, like he'd been waiting for the question, and had the response ready before I'd even finished asking it. I didn't confront him again. Instead, I did something I'm not proud of and don't regret. I started paying attention the way you pay attention to a house you suspect has a structural problem. I noticed which drawers he locked now. I noticed he'd started taking his laptop into the bathroom when he showered, which was strange enough that I almost laughed the first time I saw it, except nothing about his face. When he did, it was funny. I noticed the new gym membership, the new cologne, the way he'd started saying we about decisions that used to include me and now clearly didn't. We're renovating the Lakewood property. We're restructuring the company. A we that had nothing to do with our marriage anymore. My sister Rachel was the one who finally said what I hadn't let myself think. We were at her place in Boulder, and I was describing all of this the way you describe a puzzle you can't quite solve, and she just looked at me and said, "Sarah, he's already gone. You're just the last one to find out." I told her she was wrong. I believed it when I said it. 3 days later, David asked me to meet him for lunch at a restaurant downtown, which was strange on its own because David didn't do spontaneous lunches. David scheduled everything, including, I would come to understand, the ending of our marriage. I remember exactly what I was wearing, a blue sweater I'd had for years, because I keep coming back to that detail. how ordinary I looked on a day that turned out to be anything but ordinary. He was already seated when I arrived, and he'd ordered for both of us, which used to feel thoughtful and now, in hindsight, felt like something else entirely. A man closing out a transaction efficiently, without wasting time on my preferences. There was a manila envelope on the table between us, sitting there the way a loaded gun sits on a table, quiet and enormous at the same time. "I want to do this like adults," he said, sliding the envelope toward me before I'd even taken my coat off. I asked him what it was, though some part of me already knew, the same part of me that had been quietly cataloging locked drawers and new cologne for weeks. "Divorce papers," he said. "I had my attorney draw them up last week. It's clean. You get the car, some savings. I think it's fair, considering." "Considering what?" I asked, and I remember my voice staying steady, which surprised me, because inside I felt like the floor had opened up beneath the table. He leaned back in his chair, the same posture he used with contractors who were wasting his time. "Considering you knew what this was always going to be, Sarah. I mean, come on. 11 years, and I think we both know you were convenient. Easy. It worked when it worked." He said it so plainly, so without malice, that it took a moment to understand he thought he was being generous by explaining himself at all. I looked at that word for a long moment. Convenient. 11 years condensed into a single word chosen. I understood even then, with the same efficiency he used to negotiate a contractor's rate down by 2%. The restaurant kept moving around us. Waiters, clinking glasses, a couple laughing at the next table over something I would never know, while I sat there holding a manila envelope that contained the legal end of everything I had built my adult life around. And the strangest part, the part one still think about, is that I felt something shift inside me in that exact moment, something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with clarity. I opened the envelope. I read exactly one page. And then I asked the waiter for a pen. David's face changed when I asked for the pen. I don't think he expected that. I think, if I'm honest, he'd built up an entire script in his head for how this lunch would go. The tears, the pleading, maybe some anger, he could calmly absorb and then walk away from feeling like the reasonable one. What he didn't have a script for was silence. I signed on the line his attorney had marked with a small yellow tab, right there at the table, without reading past the first page. Not because I didn't care what it said. I cared more than I had about almost anything in years, but because I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that reading every clause wouldn't change a single word of it, and that the only thing left in my control was how I chose to leave that restaurant. "That's it," he said, and for the first time that afternoon, something in his voice wavered. He'd expected a fight. He'd built himself up for one. "That's it," I said, and I slid the envelope back across the table, folded my napkin, and stood up. "I want to tell you," I said, something devastating in that moment, something sharp enough that he'd remember it for years. I didn't. I just picked up my coat and walked out of that restaurant into a cold Denver afternoon, and the strangest thing happened as I stood on the sidewalk waiting for my car. I felt lighter than I had in months. Not happy. Not yet. But lighter, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying. I didn't go back to the house that night. I checked into a Best Western off the interstate with the 2 bags I kept permanently packed in my trunk, the ones I'd started quietly filling weeks earlier, without fully admitting to myself why. I lay on that stiff hotel comforter and stared at the ceiling and waited to feel something that resembled devastation. It didn't come. What came instead was a strange, clean quiet, like a house after a storm has passed, and you're finally allowed to survey the damage in daylight. David, I later learned from my sister Rachel, who still had a few friends in our old social circle, threw a party that Saturday. Not a small gathering, an actual party, catered, with the new truck parked out front like a prop in a photo shoot. He told people I'd seen it coming for a while and that we'd both agreed it was time. He raised a toast to new beginnings. Someone posted a photo of him holding a champagne glass, grinning the way men grin when they believe they've gotten away with something. I didn't see any of this in real time. I saw it 8 months later, when Rachel finally showed me, and by then it didn't hurt the way it would have that first week. By then, I was already 3 states away. Here's what David didn't know. Sitting at that party with his champagne and his new truck, I had spent the last 4 years of our marriage building something of my own, quietly on the side, in the hours he assumed I spent on nothing in particular. I'd gotten my real estate license the year before his father died, not because I planned for any of this, but because I needed something that belonged only to me. I'd been doing small deals on weekends, flipping 2 modest properties near Fort Collins with money from my own savings account, the one he never asked about because he assumed, correctly for 11 years and incorrectly after that I had nothing worth hiding. 3 days after I signed those papers, I sold the second property. 4 days after that, I closed my accounts at the bank we'd shared and moved everything to a credit union 200 miles away. I called a moving company while sitting in that Best Western parking lot and had them pack up my half of a storage unit we'd kept for years, mostly my grandmother's furniture, things David had always called clutter. I didn't take anything of his. I didn't want anything of his. I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, 3 weeks later, a city I'd chosen almost at random from a list I'd made months earlier during nights I couldn't sleep, back when some quiet part of me already suspected where things were heading, even if I hadn't let myself say it out loud. I told almost no one where I'd gone. My sister knew. My mother knew. That was it. David tried calling for the first 2 weeks. I know because my old number, which I let expire without transferring, showed the missed calls piling up before it finally shut off entirely. I wasn't hiding out of fear. I was building, quietly and deliberately, the way you rebuild a house after a fire, starting with the foundation, not worrying yet about how it would look from the outside. What I didn't know yet, in that first year, was how much David's new life would come to depend on assumptions about me that were no longer true. He assumed I'd struggle. He assumed, I'd learn much later, that I'd eventually run out of money and come asking for help, the way he'd apparently told people at that party I would. He built an entire version of my future in his head, and every part of it was wrong. Asheville gave me exactly what I didn't know I needed, a place where nobody knew the name Whitfield, where nobody asked how David was doing, where I could simply exist as Sarah, a woman with a real estate license and a small amount of savings and absolutely no history that anyone local cared to ask about. I rented a small apartment above a bakery in the first month, the kind of place that smelled like cinnamon every morning whether you wanted it to or not, and I took a job with a local brokerage that specialized in mountain properties for people relocating from bigger cities. I was good at it in a way that surprised me. 11 years of managing David's moods, his father's business dinners, his sister's complicated feelings about everything. It turned out that kind of patience translated well into handling difficult buyers and impossible sellers. Within a year, I'd built a small but steady client list. Within 2, I'd saved enough to put a down payment on a modest craftsman house on the edge of town, the kind with a wraparound porch and a garden bed I filled with tomatoes and zinnias because I could, because nobody was there to tell me it was a waste of water. I met Michael during my second year in Asheville at a housewarming party thrown by a colleague. He ran a small furniture restoration business out of a converted warehouse, the kind of quiet, steady man who asked questions and actually waited for the answers. When I told him I was divorced, he didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer them. He just nodded and said, "That sounds like it was a long time coming," which was truer than he could have known. Meanwhile, back in Denver, things were unraveling for David in ways I only pieced together later, mostly through Rachel, who still had a network of mutual acquaintances that occasionally passed information her way like driftwood. Jessica, the office manager whose name had once lit up his phone on a Sunday afternoon, moved in with him within 4 months of our divorce being finalized. Within a year, she'd convinced him to expand Whitfield Construction faster than his father's old business model could support: new equipment, a second warehouse, a line of credit against the commercial properties he'd inherited. David, who had spent his whole life being the son rather than the decision-maker, apparently didn't have the instincts his father had built over 30 years. He trusted Jessica's confidence the way he'd once trusted mine, except Jessica, unlike me, had never actually run a household budget in her life. The company started bleeding money in year 2. Not dramatically, nothing that would make headlines, just a slow, steady erosion of the kind that happens when someone overextends credit and underestimates costs. He sold one of the 3 commercial properties to cover a shortfall. Then, according to Rachel's sources, Jessica left him for a regional manager at a competing firm, taking with her, in a final insult he apparently didn't see coming, a set of business contacts he'd introduced her to himself. I want to be clear that I didn't celebrate any of this when I heard it. I'd built too much peace by then to spend it gloating over someone else's collapse. But I won't pretend there wasn't a certain quiet satisfaction in learning that the version of the story he'd told at that champagne party, the confident man who'd traded up, who'd finally gotten the life he deserved, hadn't held together the way he'd assumed it would. By the 3rd year, David had sold the second commercial property. Whitfield Construction, once his father's proud legacy, had shrunk down to a handful of residential contracts and a used truck that had replaced the black pickup, which he'd also had to sell. He was, by every account Rachel passed along, a man quietly coming apart at the seams of a life he'd built on the assumption that some things, including me, would simply wait around for him to need them again. That's when he hired the investigator. I found out because a woman named Diane Ferris called my office in Asheville on a Tuesday afternoon, polite and professional, saying she'd been retained by David Whitfield to locate his ex-wife regarding an urgent personal matter. I sat at my desk for a long moment after that call, looking out at the mountains through my office window, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not fear, not even much surprise, just a strange, settled curiosity about what exactly a man like David considered urgent enough to spend money tracking down a woman he'd once called convenient. I told Diane Ferris she could pass along my email. I didn't offer a phone number, and I didn't tell Michael right away, not because I was hiding it, but because some part of me needed to sit with it alone first, to understand what I actually felt before I let anyone else's reaction shape mine. 2 days later, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "Sarah, please." I read that email 3 times before I opened it, which tells you something about how much power a single subject line can still hold, even 3 years and 2,000 miles removed from the man who wrote it. "Sarah, please," it began. "I know I have no right to reach out like this. I know what I did, and I've had a long time to sit with it. I lost the business. I lost almost everything, honestly. But that's not why I'm writing. I think about you more than you'd believe. I think about that lunch, what I said, the word I used. I was a different person that year, grieving and stupid and cruel in ways I didn't even understand, until I lost everything the same way I made you lose everything. I'd like to see you if you're willing. Just to talk. Just to say the things I should have said 3 years ago." I sat with that email for 4 days before I answered it, and in those 4 days I told Michael everything. The marriage, the lunch, the envelope, all of it, laid out across our kitchen table one evening while he listened without interrupting, the way he always did. When I finished, he just reached over and put his hand over mine and said, "Whatever you decide to do with that email, I'm not worried about it." He meant it too. That, more than almost anything else, told me how far I'd actually come. I agreed to meet David, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to see with my own eyes whether the man in that email was real or just another performance, the way the champagne party had been a performance for people who needed to believe his version of the story. We met at a coffee shop in Charlotte, a neutral city, his suggestion, and I arrived early enough to watch him walk in from across the street before he saw me. He looked older than 3 years should account for. Thinner. The confident posture I remembered from that restaurant lunch was gone, replaced by something smaller, a man who'd learned, the hard way, that certainty is not the same thing as competence. "You look good," he said when he sat down, and I could hear him searching for the right register, uncertain, for maybe the first time in his life, of how to read a room he wasn't controlling. "I am good," I said, and I meant it plainly, without cruelty. He talked for a while. About the business, about Jessica, about his father's death, and how he understood now, in a way he hadn't then, that grief had made him someone he didn't recognize and didn't like. He apologized more than once, using the word convenient himself this time, turning it over like he finally understood its weight. He asked, eventually carefully, whether there was any chance at all, that we might try again, now that he was, in his words, finally the man he should have been the first time. I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered, not for effect, but because I wanted to be sure of what I actually felt, rather than what the moment seemed to be asking of me. "David," I said, "I believe you're sorry. I even believe you've changed some. But I didn't spend the last 3 years waiting to find out. I spent them building a life I actually want to be in." I told him, gently, about Asheville, about the brokerage, about the craftsman house with the tomatoes and the zinnias. I didn't mention Michael by name. Some things weren't his to know. His face did something complicated when I said that, not anger, which almost would have been easier to watch, but a kind of quiet recognition, the look of a man finally understanding that the door he was hoping to walk back through had, at some point without his noticing, simply stopped existing. "I hope you're happy," he said finally, and for once, I believed he meant it. "I am," I told him, and I stood, paid for my own coffee, and walked out into a Charlotte afternoon that had nothing at all to do with him. I never heard from David again after that, though Rachel mentioned once, almost a year later, that he'd sold the last of Whitfield Construction and moved to manage a smaller crew for someone else's company. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard it. I mostly just felt distant from it, the way you feel about a house you used to live in that's since been sold to strangers. Michael and I got married the following spring, in our own backyard in Asheville, with zinnias from my garden in the centerpieces and no one giving speeches about how it was all meant to be. It wasn't fate. It was just two people who'd learned, in different ways, what it looks like to build something honest. If you've ever been called convenient by someone who is supposed to love you, if you've ever been handed an envelope across a table by someone who thought silence meant defeat, I want you to know that the quiet you feel walking away isn't emptiness. It's room. Room to build something that word never had any right to describe. If this story meant something to you, stay with us. There's another one waiting.